Welcome back to Inkpot. In this video, we will discuss what is it that makes sharecropping still a prevalent and popular form of tenancy in the real world. So in the previous video, we saw that fixed rent is a superior form of tenancy on the basis of the efficiency criterion. So fixed rent maximizes economic surplus, whereas because of sharecropping, there is lower agricultural surplus or lower agricultural productivity as the tenant tends to undersupply his labor or effort. However, now the question arises that if fixed rent is superior and it is efficient, then why is it that we see sharecropping at all in the real world? So, assuming that the land markets work efficiently, why do landlords even offer a sharecropping contract knowing that the tenant is going to undersupply the labor? So what is it that sharecropping is still popular? What reasons can we find that sharecropping is a popular form of tenancy? Now in our model, what we didn't consider is that the production function is not deterministic but stochastic, or we can say in simpler words that agricultural production is risky because it is mostly weather dependent. Now, if exerting L star units of effort does not guarantee the F of L star units of output, then the tenant is being exposed to risk. So if the landlord offers a fixed rent contract to the tenant puts in his L star units of labor, but still the output is not F L star because the weather went bad and there was a crop failure. If there is still a fixed rent contract, then the tenant will have to pay the fixed amount of F, let's say, even if the output is 0. As a result, the tenant is bearing too much risk. Sharecropping, on the other hand, saves the tenant from this kind of risk because he has to pay only one part of the output. So if output is 0, then the share that the tenant pays is also 0. This risk sharing service that the sharecropping tenancy provides is the attractive feature of sharecropping. So because of this risk sharing, sharecropping is still. So let's try to algebraically see now that the sharecropping tenancy form helps the tenant by sharing his risk. So let's assume that there are two output levels, good and bad. Now these two are uncertain events in the sense that you can have a good output with P probability and bad output with 1 minus P probability. So we are saying that the tenant exerts the same L bar level of effort, but despite this, because of the weather, the output can either be good or bad with the respective probabilities as defined. And of course, G is greater than B. So the output in the good state is higher than the output in the bad state. Further, we assume that the landlord is wealthy and he is risk neutral, whereas the tenant is poor and risk averse. So remember from microeconomics that risk aversion falls with higher wealth. So therefore we have assumed that the landlord who is wealthier is risk neutral, whereas the tenant who is poor is risk averse. Now this risk neutrality and risk aversion means that the landlord only cares about the expected return that he gets, whereas the tenant who is risk averse cares about the spread or variance of the returns as well. So the landlord will be indifferent between two options as long as the expected returns are same, but the tenant will want to look at the variance or the spread of the returns even if the expected returns are the same. So even if the expected returns are the same, the tenant is not going to be indifferent between the two options. He will pick the one which has a lower spread or a lower variance. Further, we introduce the notation that R is the amount of fixed rent that is paid. If the fixed rent option is chosen, R is the amount of fixed rent, and the small s is the share of landlord under sharecropping. Now, since landlord is risk neutral, let's make him indifferent between the two contracts, that is fixed rent and sharecropping. So how do we make him indifferent? We will make the return from fixed rent equal to, we will make the expected return from fixed rent equal to the expected return from sharecropping. Now what is going to be the landlord's expected return from fixed rent? It's going to be P times R plus 1 minus P times R. So if the crop is good, he will get R with probability P. If the crop is bad, then also he gets R with probability 1 minus P, because that's the fixed rent contract all about. He will get R no matter what happens. Now if he instead takes the sharecropping contract, then his expected return is PSG plus 1 minus PSB. So when the output is good, the landlord gets a share small s of G, and this happens with probability P, and similarly for the output in the bad event. Solving for S, we get R divided by PG plus 1 minus P B. So what we can say is that if the landlord chooses this S, let's just call it S star perhaps, when the landlord offers S star, it makes his expected return same. This same S star also makes the tenant's expected return also the same. What are the tenant's expected returns from the good state? The fixed rent contract, it is P times G minus R plus 1 minus P times B minus R. And from sharecropping it is P times 1 minus SG plus 1 minus P 1 minus SB. So if we equate this, you will see that this S is also the same as what we calculated earlier. So we are saying that with this particular form, with this particular S, both the expected returns are equalized. However, even though tenant's expected returns are equalized, he is not indifferent because of the assumption of risk aversion that we had imposed earlier. So even though his expected returns are the same, he is not equally happy with the fixed rent and sharecropping contracts because he is going to look at the spread of the two contracts as well. So to look at the spread, let's see what is the difference between the tenant's return in the good state. Under fixed rent, the tenant gets G minus R in the good state, and under sharecropping, the tenant gets 1 minus S of G in the good state. Now, if you subtract it and see, and use the same S star as before here, so you can try that out on your own. Just replace this S star, S by, S star as we had seen. Put this value over here and calculate this difference, and you will see that G minus R is greater than 1 minus SG. So in words we can say that the fixed rent contract gives a higher return to the tenant in the good state. Similarly, let's compare the tenant's return in the bad state. Under fixed rent, he gets B minus R, and under sharecropping, he gets 1 minus SB. Again, subtracting, here you will see that 1 minus SB is greater than B minus R. So, sharecropping gives higher return to the tenant in the bad state. Now we know that G is greater than B. As a result, 1 minus S of G is greater than 1 minus S of B. Using this along with these two inequalities, we can write that G minus R is greater than 1 minus SG. This is coming from this inequality. Then that's greater than 1 minus SB coming from this inequality, and that is greater than B minus R, which is coming from the final inequality over here. So note that these are the returns from sharecropping, and these are the returns from fixed rent. So if we want to rank this on a number line, we can say that fixed rent in the bad state is the worst, so that's this. Then sharecropping in the bad state is next. sharecropping in the good state is next to that, and the fixed rent in the good state, is the best. This here, the middle line here that I'm drawing, is the expected return from fixed rent and the sharecropping contract. So remember that we had said that both the fixed rent and sharecropping give the same expected return to the tenant. So that expected return I am just denoting by this line in the middle from here. So around the same expected return, sharecropping gives a lower spread, whereas fixed rent gives a larger spread despite having the same expected return. Looking at this, then we can conclude that the sharecropper, that the tenant who is that sharecropping protects the tenant from risk, and hence the tenant chooses the sharecropping contract. So this is the reason that we see sharecropping being popular despite its inefficiency. Although in the good state the tenant is better off with fixed rent, but in the bad state the tenant is better off with sharecropping, and sharecropping is what minimizes the variance in his consumption or in his return. Because risk-averse people prefer any alternative with lower spread and lower variance, the sharecropping gives the narrower spread which the risk-averse tenant prefers. Bringing in risk then tells us why is sharecropping more popular than the fixed rent contract, even though fixed rent is more efficient than sharecropping.